Okay, so the task now is to redo problem 1 using the simplex method instead of the geometric approach. To do that, the first thing we have to do is write down a system of equalities, that is equations, instead of inequalities. And we use these things called slack variables to convert the inequalities to equations. So for each inequality, excluding these non-negativity ones, we write down a corresponding equation by introducing the slack variables. So we're going to use S1 and S2 for slack variables. And this is what we get: x plus y plus S1. Now, instead of less than or equal to, is equal to 5. Right, so that's an equation, our first equation. Then x plus 2y plus S2 equals 6, right? Then our third equation is taken from the objective function by rearranging it so that 0 is on the right hand side and getting minus 3x minus 4y plus p on the other side. Okay, so all this gets translated into the simplex tableau, where we label the columns with variable names, starting with our primary variables x and y, and then our slack variables S1, S2, and then finally p. Okay, so our coefficients are as follows. From the first equation, right, from the first equation I get 1, 1 again, 1 again for S1. There's no S2 appearing in the first equation, so that gets a 0, and P is also not there, so that gets a 0. And then this second equation gives me a 1 for X, 2 for Y. There's no S1, so it gets a 0. There's an S2 with a coefficient of 1. And then there's no P, so it gets a 0. Right, and then I start filling in my third row, where I get a minus 3 for X, a minus 4 for Y, 0 for the slack variables because they're not there, and then P is there, has a coefficient of 1, so it gets a 1, and a vertical bar to delineate my last column, right, which is the numbers here, 5, 6, and 0. So 5, 6, 0. And typically we put another column here. Okay, and also what the final touch is on this is we need to label our rows. Our rows initially are labeled with the slack variables S1 and S2. Okay? Now the row names are going to change. The column names are always going to stay the same as we do our pivot operations. Okay, so how do we do a pivot operation? That's what we need to do. We need to start the first pivot operation. Well, to identify the pivot column, right, we note that -4 is the most negative in the bottom row. So we look at all the elements in the bottom row and we decide which one is the most negative. That's -4. Okay, so that means that the Y column is the pivot column. Then how do we determine the pivot row? Well, we take the numbers over here in the last column, well actually not including the 0, but just the 5 and the 6, right? And we divide them by the numbers over here, and we see what ratio is the smallest. So that means for here, for the first row, we take 5 over 1. Now that's 5, okay? Then we take 6 over 2. Well, that's 3, right? So which is bigger, 3 or 5? Well, 3 is bigger. So that means that this row has become the pivot row. And all that means, the pivot column and the pivot row, all that those mean is that we're identifying what we call the pivot element, which is this 2 here, the position of the pivot element. Okay, so that 2, that position that's holding the 2, that's the pivot. Okay, all right, so the first task, once you've identified the pivot, is to change it into a 1. Okay, and to do that, we need to divide by 2 or multiply by 1/2. So that's the first operation we're going to do. We're going to write 1/2 row 2 just replaces the old row 2. Okay? And so then what we get is fairly simple. We just have to copy everything down. Okay, we're going to copy everything else down, but we're going to do an operation to row 2. So copying row 1, 1, 1, 1, 0, 0, 5. Right, and then copying row 3, -3, -4, right, it's -4, 0, 0, 1, 0. Let me kind of scoot this up a little bit. All right. Then we do our operation to row 2, which is a simple operation. We're just dividing by 2. So 1/2, 1, 0, 1/2, 0, 3. And I'm going to go ahead and keep my vertical and horizontal bars like that. Let me write that 1/2 a little more clearly. Okay. I'm going to scoot it down a little bit, and I'm going to copy my labels again. So S1 and S2. Well, at this point, what you can do instead of writing S1, S2 is you can switch out, or how do you say? So because of the position of the pivot over here in the Y column and the S2 row, that means that the S2 row is now going to be called the Y row. So you can do that at this point. And then S1 is still there, and then everything across the top stays the same because the column names never change. Only the row names that change. Okay. All right. So we've got that. We've got our pivot, which remember our pivot was right here. Right? It's now changed into a 1. That was the goal of that whole process right there, is to change the pivot into a 1. Now we can start naming our main pivot operations. And the idea is that we want this entire column, the Y column, to have 1 in the pivot position and then 0 everywhere else. Okay? So what operations are going to accomplish that? Well, we're always going to multiply the additive inverse of the number we're trying to change into 0 by the row, by the pivot row, and then add that to the original row. So, just let's start with row 3 because that's a little easier to see at the moment. So that row 3 has a -4 in it, and that -4 needs to be changed into a 0. So we say, what's the additive inverse of -4? That's 4. Right, so we're going to multiply 4 by the pivot row, row 2, and then we add row 3, the row that we're trying to replace with something with a 0 in the appropriate place. And so all that's going to replace row 3. And then we might as well, while we're at it, before we go on and do that operation, let's just figure out what the other operation is going to be that's going to change this 1 into a 0. All right, so the additive inverse of 1 is -1. So we write -1 times row 2, our pivot, right, plus row 1 is going to replace row 1. All right, so those are our pivot operations that are going to lead to the next tableau. And the next tableau is going to be, it's going to have S1Y, and then X, Y, S1, S2, P, and the final unnamed column. Okay, so let's fill this out. So the pivot row is not going to change, so I might as well just copy it. Okay, so 1/2, 1, 0, 1/2, 0, and 3. Okay. And if we did everything right, we're going to get 0 here and 0 here. All right. So let's look at this operation up top here, the 4 times row 2 plus row 3. So looking at row 2 and row 3 over here, right? Let's just focus, let's draw a rectangle here and focus on row 2 and row 3. Okay? So we're going to do 4 times row 2 and add to row 3 and see what we get, okay? So 4 times row 2, so looking at these now, right? 4 times 1/2 is 2. And then that's a -3, right? It's a -3 there. So 4 times 1/2 is 2, and then plus a -3 gives me a -1 in row 3. I notice I have a mistake here. Look, for some reason I've written row 2 here. Row 3 is the row that's going to be replaced. So that's what I'm doing. Okay. All right. So then if we keep going, of course, when we multiply the pivot element by 4 and then add the -4, I'm going to get 0, and that's what was planned, right? Okay, and then multiplying a 4 by this 0 and then adding that 0 gives me just 0, right? And then multiplying 4 by 1/2 here gives me a 2, and then plus 0 gives me a 2. And then multiplying 4 here gives me 0, and then plus 1 gives me a 1. And then multiplying 4 here gives me 12, and then plus 0 gives me 12. Okay? Alright, so then what? I want to do this -1 row 2 plus row 1, right? And replace row 1. So that's basically minus row 2 plus row 1, or if you prefer to think of it as row 1 minus row 2, that's also okay, but it's going to replace row 1, right? Okay, so let's do that. Let's fill out row 1 by row 1 minus row 2. So here, 1 minus 1/2 is 1/2. 1 minus 1 is 0, as planned. 1 minus 0 is 1. 0 minus 1/2 is -1/2, right? 0 minus 0 is 0, and 5 minus 3 is 2. Okay. So let me just get this stuff out of the way. Okay, so now we're done with that pivot operation, and the question at this point is, in that bottom row, do we have any more negative numbers? And the answer is yes, we have one. Right? We have one negative number, so this column becomes my new pivot column. Right? We're going to want to find the pivot row. Let me scoot this over, make some space for myself, form some ratios. So we do 2 over 1/2, right? 2 over 1/2. Well, that's equal to 4, right? So there's 4. And then 3 over 1/2 is equal to 6, right? So which one's smaller, 4 or 6? So 4. So that makes this the pivot row, and that makes this the pivot element, okay? 1/2 in the X column. All right, how do you change 1/2 into 1? You multiply it by 2. Okay, so that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna multiply 2 by row 1 is going to replace row 1, okay? Our labels are going to stay the same. Well, oh no, at this point you can, since you've identified the pivot element, you can switch the row label. Okay, so the new first row label is going to be X, from this X here, right? It's going to replace S1. Okay, and then Y is just going to be there, left there. All right, so doing this, carrying out this row operation now, and just keep the column names the same. So X, Y, X, Y, S1, S2, P. All right, so that's a Y here, okay, and there. So 2 times row 1 replaces row 1. So that gives me a 1 here. 2 times 0 is 0. 2 times 1 is 2. 2 times -1/2 is -1. 2 times 0 is 2. 2 times 2 is 4. Okay, and everything else stays the same. 1/2, 1, 0, 1/2, 0, 3, -1, 0, 0, 2, 1, 12. Okay. So, I'm going to make some space for myself. Okay. Now what are we going to do? Okay, we're going to identify our 2 row operations that are going to get zeros where they need to be. Now remember that this was our pivot position right there. So we're trying to get these folks down here to be zeros. Okay? So what do? So we're going to use the pivot row. So we're going to multiply the pivot row by additive inverses. So the additive inverse of 1/2 is -1/2. So -1/2 row 1 plus row 2 is going to replace row 2. And then the additive inverse of -1 is just 1. So it's just going to be row 1 plus row 3 replaces row 3. Okay. All right, so what does that look like? Start filling it out. We've got X, Y. Right, up here, X, Y, S1, S2, P, oops, that's supposed to be a P, P, and then no label, and then, okay, let's carry out our row operations. -1/2 times row 1 plus row 2 gives me a 0. It's going to replace row 2, right? -1/2 times 0 plus 1 gives me 1. -1/2 times 2 gives me -1 plus 0 gives me -1. -1/2 times -1 gives me a +1/2. Add a half to that and I get 1. and then 0 and 0 gives me 0 there. And then negative a half times 4 is negative 2 plus 3 is 1. All right. Now, of course, I didn't copy. I'll copy my pivot row later. Let me go ahead and carry out my replacement of row 3. So row 3 is replaced by the sum of row 1, row 3. So 1 plus negative 1 is 0. 0 plus 0 is 0. 2 plus 0 is 2. Negative 1 plus 2 is 1. 0 plus 1 is 1. 4 plus 12 is 16. Okay, copying my pivot row 1, 0, 2, negative 1, 0, 4. At this point, we see there are no negative numbers in the bottom row. That means we're finished. And luckily, what we see is that our rows are finally named X and Y, which tells us directly what X and Y are. When we look over here, right, X is 4 and Y is 1. Oops. And then down here is where we read the value of P. P equals 16. So yeah, as before, we got X equals 4. Why did I write Y equals 2? I don't know. Y equals 1. And P equals 16.